I'd like to invite you to turn to Mark chapter 23 through 27. Mark is, of course, the best book in the Bible, right? Well, it's got the best name anyway. Maybe not. So, in any case, we're going to read from Mark chapter 2. But before we do that, I just want to explain a little bit why we're talking about rest in the new year. I talked about this a little bit last week. One of the reasons is because people make New Year's resolutions and we're going to get busy and get some work done, right? But I want to illustrate how rest is really the first requirement for getting anything done, especially when it comes to getting things done for God. On a corporate level, on a church level, I want to highlight this. This is just a list of goals for the next year, and it's not even all of them. There's a lot of challenges for any church in the next year to do. And I want to state up front as we get into the year, maybe work on some things and talk about working on some things, that following Jesus isn't just about doing and doing and doing and doing and doing. Following Jesus is about resting in Him, and then out of the strength He gives us, doing what He calls us to do. And that's just really key and foundational. I thought it'd be really important to start with that at the beginning of the year, because as we go through the year, there will be things to do. But this is the foundational truth for me, especially as I reflect about how to do what I'm called to do in this year. So that said, let's read from Mark chapter 2, 23 through 27. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as His disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to Him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" He answered them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, 'The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath.'" This is the word of the Lord. So there's generally always some confusion about the Sabbath, right? There's confusion inside of the church, and there's confusion outside of the church, especially by people who used to be part of the church. How many of you all fudge a little bit once in a while on what you might think might be Sabbath day rules, right? Once in a while. You never know quite what's allowed, what's not allowed, but you kind of come to peace with what you do, and maybe you don't come to peace, but you do it anyway. There's always some questions about what you can do on the Sabbath. Dave Beelan, who's the pastor of Madison Avenue Church, told me this a little while ago. So back in the 50s, when he was a young man growing up at First Church on Franklin, this dynamic happened every week, where after church, the Christian Reformed people at First Church would go outside, and all the guys would take out their cigarettes and have a good smoke, right? They would just enjoy having a smoke, like 40 or 50 guys outside of church. The Baptists from down the street would get out of church a little bit at a different time, or maybe go to church at a different time, and they'd see all these sort of white Christian Reformed people smoking and thinking, how could they do that, right? That's completely unbiblical. You never smoke or drink or anything if you're a Christian. These guys think they're Christian. Like, it's just ridiculous. Well, what the people who were smoking, they were thinking, these Baptist people driving back and forth after church, I know, how could they go out to eat after church? You know, that is just the most unbiblical thing. I mean, making people work on Sunday, that's completely out of order. Now, how could you do that? Right. Of course, what was actually happening is the Christian Reformed people were enjoying the good gifts that God put on earth, right, until they realized it killed them later. And the Baptist people were thinking, well, I'm not cooking on Sunday. This is exactly appropriate. Restaurant people take Monday off anyway, so what's the big deal, right? It just didn't occur to them. They're both thinking quite differently, both judging, but also both kind of fudging on the Sabbath rules. People who aren't in church have some confusion about Sabbath, too. I was at Marcia's mom's funeral, obviously, last month. And like we said, a lot of her family doesn't really go to church and doesn't really believe in Jesus very actively, although many of them are very, very spiritual. But I look over at one of my nieces who's living with an older man. And in Canada, if you live with someone for 6 months, you're legally married, but they haven't been officially legally married. And neither of them go to church, neither of them are very active in their faith. But much to my surprise, they're sitting there singing the songs, fairly traditional old songs, just fine. They're looking like sort of model church members. And I'm looking at them going, how did they get to that spot? I knew the niece had grown up in church a little bit, but the older guy that she's with, I had no idea. But he looked just as comfortable. He actually looked like a spiritual leader. And I found out later he actually is quite a mentor to many people in his company, but not a church person. So in the little reception afterwards, I said to him, he said, what's going on here? It looks like you have a faith background. He says, well, what do you mean, right? Thinking I'm going to pressure him into making a decision for Jesus. But no, I said, no, it just looks like you have a faith background because you looked very comfortable and you knew all the words. He says, oh, yeah. My parents, weren't available to me when I was young. I forget the exact reason. So I grew up with my grandparents, and they were church people. And he loved his grandpa. His grandpa was an outdoorsman, took him out hunting and fishing. And one day they're walking in the woods in the middle of the winter. He says, oh, I got lost. I can't find my way home. We're going to have to stay here tonight. And they got in the snowbank, stayed there overnight. And the next day he got up and he magically found his way back to the house. He's thinking, wait a minute, you played me. So, he wasn't really lost. He's just teaching his grandson all sorts of things about nature. So he loved his grandparents. But every Sunday they went to church. And every Sunday after church, you'd have to sit around and do absolutely nothing. And when he said to me, he says, Sunday was just such a complete waste. And he said he felt sorry because he knows I'm a preacher. He says, I'm sorry, but, really, like, seriously, Sunday was just such a complete waste to me as a kid. Until he was 10, it was probably fine, but after that, he wanted to do things. He's just like, I can't get over it. Like, what a waste of a day. And so for him, Sunday, when he got dressed on Sunday, was a little bit like getting dressed and having to put on something that many of us have really only ever seen. Maybe a couple of us have been in it, and it probably was not very enjoyable. So we all get dressed for church on Sunday. Some of us dress up a little bit. But for people, many people who aren't part of the church or who are, getting dressed for Sunday is a little bit like this. It's a straitjacket, right? And you think, I can't do anything? I just got to go to church and do this, and all my activities and all my life is just going to be tied up for a whole day. Now, what is the point? And when people who aren't Christian look at Christians who say you can't do this and you can't do that, and especially if you get told by the old Christian Reformed way of evangelism, right? What was that? You shouldn't be mowing your lawn on Sunday. That was the old way of evangelism. But people who get told you can't, it's like, why would I do that? Why would I not do anything on Sunday? Maybe for some of us it feels a little bit like that. So this morning what we're going to do is we're going to examine sort of the boundaries between being all tied up and complete freedom. My illustration for complete freedom would be to like just take my whole shirt off and like have nothing on. But that'd be awkward, right? I don't want to do that. If we're at the beach together, that might be okay, but I'm not going to do that on Sunday morning for obvious reasons. I'm going to take a drink of water because my mouth is getting dry. All right, so if we get into this text today, this is surprisingly comfortable, by the way. I think if I just wear this often enough, it'll eventually catch on. And then everyone will know what we're doing on Sunday morning, right? Going to church. All right, so where does this come from? First of all, the Old Testament commandment. It comes from the context of slavery. The Israelites were slaves in Egypt, and a lot of these rules are given for guidelines for people who really didn't have any rules of their own, so a lot of the commandments are given to that. But this rule in particular is a gift. It's a gift to people who had to work 12, 13-hour days, likely 7 days a week, especially at the end when they had to make bricks without straw. This whole concept of a day off where you don't do any work at all is a gift for people coming out of slavery. It's almost a justice issue, and in fact, it is a justice issue. To say everybody, you, your maidservant, your manservant, your donkey, your cow, whatever you have, gets a day off and there's no fudging. You ever notice that the fourth commandment, the commandment on the Sabbath, is the longest commandment, right? And somehow, ironically, it's the commandment that's the easiest to ignore. Maybe it's the longest to make it the most difficult to ignore, right? But there's a lot of details because there's a lot of ways we would fudge on taking a day of rest. You think, really, can't I just do that? Or can't I just do that? But it's really helpful to remember that the Sabbath is not supposed to be a straitjacket. It's supposed to be freedom for people who need a break. Now, thinking about Marsha's dad, for example. He worked so hard in his life. He came over with nothing, ended up working for farmers, would live in these little shacks that they had sort of out there, and they'd have to fix them up. And one of them had hogs running around underneath it, just a complete mess. He worked so hard, often 2 or 3 jobs for 40 or 50 years. And that day off was the only time he had off at all. In that sense, Sabbath is absolutely 100% a gift. And to do nothing all afternoon is something that he never would have had except for this gift back in the day that was pulled into our culture here through faith in Jesus. So that's the first thing to remember. Sabbath is, first of all, a gift. But how do we interpret it? Oh, that's new. All right. I don't know what that is, but that's new. How do we interpret it? Is that maybe the monitors? Eric doesn't know. I mean, he's just running sound, right? I don't know. Who knows? Someone can figure it out, let me know. All right. So back in the day of the Pharisees, they had a real need to obey the law. And why did they have a real need to obey the law? Well, they understood the concept of slippery slope. If you disregard the law a little bit, then you disregard it more, then you disregard it more, and pretty soon you're not anywhere near doing what God has called you to do. And it turns out that's exactly what the Israelites did. They ignored more and more of the law until they weren't obeying any of it, and then God sent them into exile. Well, coming back from exile, there was people that realized that we need to obey all the law 100%, and the Pharisees represent really the best effort of that group. They said, we need to obey all of the law. And they made these oral traditions that told how to obey all of the law. And so the Pharisees, the people that speak to Jesus in this passage, are very serious about obeying all of the law. For them, it is a big deal that Jesus is not doing, doesn't seem to be advocating for the law. Okay, maybe now my clicker don't work. Maybe just put it to the next one there. There we go, thank you. All right, so here's the story. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, his disciples picked some grain and began rubbing it together and eating it. Now, you get told in Iowa, don't mess with people's grain fields, right? You don't walk through the beans because they're going to get rust on them when it's wet. You don't walk through the corn that much when it's young because you're going to step on it. You know up front that you're not supposed to mess with people's grain fields. But here in this context, it was specifically allowed to walk through people's grain fields and take grain off them and eat them. Here's the commandment in the Old Testament. If you enter your neighbor's grain fields, you may pick up kernels with your hand and eat them, but you may not put a sickle to a standing grain. There's a similar commandment about grapes. You can walk through a vineyard and eat grapes, so you can't put them in a basket. The idea is if you're hungry, you can get something to eat from a field that's standing there. That's allowed. But you mayn't do it on the Sabbath. So when they came through, the Pharisees said, look, why are you doing what's unlawful on the Sabbath? Now, all of these laws, interestingly, about doing things or not doing things on the Sabbath have to do with creative activities. Because going back to the Old Testament, God created things on 6 days. On the 7th day, he rested from all this creative activity and saw that it was very good, right? So all of these laws have to do with creating things or exercising dominion over your environment. And in some legalistic sense of the word, taking grain out of a field and putting it in your mouth is somehow symbolic of the larger thing of harvesting and put it in your mouth. It's not really, but it's symbolic of that. And that's why the Pharisees get upset, because technically it's harvesting, and then it's not allowed. So what does Jesus do? How does he answer? He says, yeah, you're right, guys, stop doing that. He says this, have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need in the days of Abiathar the high priest? He entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for the priest to eat, and then he also gave some to his companions. So I was thinking about this passage this week going, well, what's the parallel? Because one is about Sabbath, and the other is about breaking the rules for the house of God. Well, the parallel is eating. out of the context of what's technically allowed by the law. And so what does Jesus say? He says, basically, if you're hungry, the details of the Sabbath law don't apply in such a way to take your life away. You're allowed to break the Sabbath to get food if you're hungry. In the same way, it was okay for David because he was hungry to eat the bread that had been in the house of God. This is not the point, to take life away. If you're hungry, if you're in need, you can get life on the Sabbath day. Notice that Jesus wasn't eating, by the way, but his disciples were. And then he says this key line, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. And here's where I think a lot of us, as we figure out what we specifically feel comfortable with doing on the Sabbath, sort of get our inspiration from. Because we understand that we were not made to fit in the Sabbath box. The Sabbath box was made for us to find life in. So, in real ways, we get to understand that the Sabbath isn't meant to be a straitjacket. It's meant to be more like a comfortable sweatshirt. So this sweatshirt is not the fanciest sweatshirt in the world. Joanna actually gave it to, so Marcia's sister actually gave it to Marcia about 10 years ago, and she wore it for a couple years, and it got a little old for her, and I started wearing it, found it kind of comfortable. And we've kind of messed it up a little bit. I got some stains on it, we scrubbed it out, and it got faded a little bit. Last week it was in the basement, and one of the cats took an opportunity to, pee on it. I've washed it. But it's kind of one of my go-to sweatshirts just to wear at home when I want to be comfortable. And in many ways, not in the way that, don't dress up for church, that's not what this is about. But in many ways, it represents, I think, what Sabbath is about. When you're not around people, being who you are and being comfortable in your skin and doing really things that are recreative, but not creative in the sense of exercising control over your environment. It's about finding life. It's about stepping aside from work and doing things that God has called us to do, not activity-wise, but rest-wise. This is not that easy for me, to be perfectly honest. First of all, I'm paid and called by you to work on Sunday. Well, that's a little awkward, ain't it, right? Take the Sabbath. Don't work on the Sabbath. I mean, I am, but, I'm a pastor, so I'm allowed to break the law. But you guys can't work. I mean, it's a little bit like, what's that about? Well, there's a nice passage in Matthew that says the priests in the Lord are without guilt when they work on the Lord's day in the Lord's house, right? So the idea is if you're working for God directly on the Sabbath day, that's sort of excused. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I get recreated on Sunday and find life from rest on Sunday. So it still means I need to take a day off. And honestly, I'm amazed how many pastors, when I ask them or other people ask them, say, do you take Monday off? Do you take, oh, no, I don't have time to do that. Like, it's the fourth commandment, right? It's like, do not murder. Just take a day off. Easier said than done. So I take work off from church on Monday. That's why you don't get phone calls back from me on Monday usually. And I don't do any household stuff on Sunday. Don't go to stores or anything like that. So it's kind of a mishmash between the two. But I'm still seeking about how I can get more into this Sabbath experience. And a couple things have convicted me on that lately. One is a book called The Emotionally Healthy Leader. And there's an emotionally healthy spirituality. This guy writes a lot of books. He writes The Emotionally Healthy Family, The Emotionally Healthy Cat, The Emotionally Healthy Hamster. He doesn't do all that, but he's got a lot of books out. And so Mike Gulker was talking to somebody, and he said, you got to read this book, this Emotionally Healthy Leader book. I think it would be helpful. And so Mike, in conversation, said to me, have you ever read this book? And I said, well, I know somebody who knows him, and I have 2 or 3 of books on his shelf, but no, I really haven't read it. I haven't gotten to that part. Why? Because, obviously getting into stuff like this takes a lot of work, and you have to be prepared for it. So he encouraged me to read it, and I did. And I think the 5th chapter is on Sabbath. Turns out to be emotionally healthy, you need to spend time with yourself, time with God, reflecting on who you are and all the issues of life, right? So he said, as a Sabbath, take a day off from sundown to sundown. Doesn't need to be Saturday or Sunday. Just take a day off. Set it completely aside. Don't do work for home. Don't do work for church. Don't do anything except recreate, spend time with family, spend time with God. And I thought to myself, I hate this chapter. Like, seriously. How many of you do that? Sundown to sundown, do nothing. Anybody? One person? Maybe some of you retirees do that? It's the fourth commandment, Mark. Why am I not doing this? I don't murder anybody. Right? Haven't yet. Don't plan to. Lying is pretty obvious. Don't do that. You get convicted. But it's like, why? Well, the second time I read, I thought, I think there's some life-giving possibilities in here. And the third or fourth time, I think maybe in 2 or 3 years, I can live into this, right? And that's really the goal this morning, to live into this experience of the opportunity God has put in front of us. So, and because I'll forget later, I then went into this book, Sabbath, which is just a continual inspiration of experiences and sort of ongoing confirmation. Because honestly, most of us don't have that many people in our lives who are doing a real Sabbath who we can learn from. So if we realize that we're not doing something, we need a mentor somewhere. And that book is just simply called Sabbath. So what do we do with this? There's honestly probably about, a couple hours more things that we could talk about and say, but that would not make the Sabbath feel like the Sabbath today. So we're going to just summarize. These are sweatshirt thoughts. This takes time to go into. Obviously, you're here on Sunday, you're taking some time off, but this takes time to go into. It takes time to pray. It takes time to learn. It takes time to set aside our devices. It takes time to have different habits as a family. So many of us know how to work. Many of us don't know how to rest. It's an opportunity to grow into. It's not about Sunday. And I had a hard time thinking how to say this because I don't want to sort of take away Sunday. But it's not about Sunday. If we're going to be legalistic about this, we should be legalistic about Saturday because that's the actual Sabbath, right? It's not about Sunday. We worship on Sunday because the Lord rose on Sunday, and that's why Christians started worshiping on Sunday. My sister, who's in Abu Dhabi, has Sunday on Friday because everybody worships on Friday there. You can't worship on Sunday there because you'll get in trouble. So Friday's the day there. It's about spending time with God as He's invited us to find recreation. It's not about Sunday. One of the things that struck me, again, talking to family in Canada, but also here, is our culture is changing in what's called blue laws. Laws against retailing and being open on Sunday are pretty much gone. What that means is that a good part of our population has to work on Sunday. And often the lowest income works on Sunday at stores and all kinds of things. They simply are not going to get to church on Sunday. So I think one of the opportunities for us as a church is to figure out that no matter how much we invite, no matter how great worship is, people simply aren't going to come to church on Sunday because they're not available. So what can we do? Invite them to our house? Have Thursday night worship? At the very least, at the very beginning, understand that Sunday morning is no longer a time that's available to much of our culture, neither is Sunday afternoon. Sometimes we're invited to change versus trying to change culture to what was the norm 30 or 40 years ago. I could talk about this for a long time, but I won't. At its very foundation, Sabbath is about justice. It's about God giving you a day off so you can be recreated. It's about justice when we think about how to apply this to other people's lives around us and to the world. But it's about God giving you this as an act of justice. Why give it up? Something He gave you. Why give it up freely? I've been trying to figure out why give up my rest. And sometimes it's because I like to work. Because I do. Sometimes it's because, I don't want to do it tomorrow and it's more convenient to do it today. And I'm just kind of, in a sense, lazy. Because I'll just go do it right now and I don't do it tomorrow. Not disciplined enough. Sometimes not doing things on Sunday just realizes that I don't need that box of macaroni and cheese from Meijer right now. I got enough food in my house to last till tomorrow. Other times it's the most appropriate thing to do, just to get out of town and maybe even stop by a gas station or go somewhere where, yeah, people have to work for you, but you also have to get away, and maybe they have another day off. Don't let fear, anxiety, ignorance, or outright disobedience keep you from experiencing Sabbath rest. I think we experience God when we work, hopefully, Lord willing you do. We think, man, God has equipped me to do this. He's right here in this, helped me through my struggles, giving me joy in the middle of the work. But also, hopefully, you experience God when you rest. And at its deepest level, the reason I think I give up on Sabbath is I am just afraid of not doing everything that I need to do. Marsha was just sharing with me that when she was young, putting your hands in your pockets, Elias likes walking around like this because it's kind of comfortable. But when I was young, and I remember this too when she said it, if you put your hands in your pockets, the first response from the older people was, get your hands out of your pocket, right? Anybody remember that? A few people? Why? Because if you have your hands in your pocket, you're not ready for action. And because I think of the way that my parents had to grow up in a hard-scrabble world where there was so much poverty, I think you just always had to be ready for action. And sometimes we need to be ready to rest, to receive from God what he has for us so that we can do what he's called us to do. And don't let fear or anxiety or anything else keep you from experiencing that. It's okay to rest and to push the thoughts of always having to go, always having to do, always having to be, always having to maybe even get on entertainment. Push that away. This is a short list of what we're called to do as a church. There's so many more things. You have your own list of what you're called to do in this next year. Some of it health-related, some of it work-related, some of it goal-related. And as we know, the year always brings things that we never saw coming. But as we begin the year, I want to invite us to consider how God might be calling us to rest and to rest in him. Let's pray. Lord Jesus Christ, you have called us out of darkness. Some of us quite literally. We were addicted. We were confused. Our eyes were blind. We saw nothing but the need for a next fix, the need for the next thing. You called us out of darkness and brought us into light. And we thank you for that. But some of us were able to grow up in a context that was filled with Christian teaching. And we've known about the Sabbath from the time we were 2. But I thank you for the gift of rest. I thank you for the gift that you give us in the middle of that. I pray that you teach each one of us. Some of us who are really busy on Sundays, and some of us who have all the time in the world because we're older or unemployed or disabled. I pray that you teach all of us how to spend time with you. And you would help and teach us how to push away any thought of I need to do something else, or it just isn't worth it, or I don't want to do it. Help us truly not to be disciplined to the sort of harsh letter of the law as we interpret it, but to experience life and freedom and joy and fellowship with other people and conversation and festival, whatever that means, Lord, in our lives. So we can experience your goodness in the land of the living. I pray that even in this West Michigan cloudy days, that you would give us life. You help us to experience opportunity. I pray that we'd be an inspiration to each other. And I pray that as a church, as we rest in you, that you would continue to do more than we can ask or imagine when we do work, and even when we don't work, that you would work through us, that you would flow through us, that you would pour your life through us, and help us to be the people that you've called us to be. And I want to pray for some particular people or scenarios, or I guess, but people I have in mind from you. But I want to pray for those of us who are teaching, who Monday morning, tomorrow morning, have to get up and face a group of 18 to 25 kids, to some of them who are just really active. And I pray that as we rest, as we receive from you, we'd be able to speak truth and have authority over each one of those children. And that they would listen, and your words and your insight and insight about creation and the way the world works would get into their heads, and that they would be still. That they would be still, Father. And I pray that you be with those of us who are just really suffering in a relationship. And I don't know what the answer is, Lord, but I pray that you protect. I pray that you inspire. I pray that the Word of God would be an inspiration, that you would give strength, that you would inflate what is depleted. You would bring confidence and knowledge that is so much missing. And you'd help every individual who's in that situation to be able to be filled in behalf of that relationship in every extent, in every sense of the word. In every sense of the word, Lord, I pray that you be with all of us and teach us how to be who you've called us to be. But I pray that you be with those of us who need a word from you, a ray of light from you, and that you'd shine into our lives and reveal to us your perfect, amazing, glorious will. You would set us free by your very power. You'd illuminate our hearts and equip us to be, again, who you've called us to be. Pray that you be with us as we go today, that we experience your grace and mercy and truth. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.